The scorching Texas sun bore down on Zeke Everton as he surveyed the barren stretch of land he called home. Sweat trickled down his weathered face, carving trails through the dust that seemed permanently etched into his skin. The year was 1875, and drought had plagued the region for 18 long, merciless months. "Damn this God-forsaken heat," he muttered, kicking at the cracked earth beneath his worn leather boots. At 32, Zeke had the hardened countenance of a man who'd seen twice that many years. His eyes, once as blue as the wide western sky, had dulled to the color of faded denim, matching the lifelessness of his parched property. The small ranch he'd inherited from his father had once been promising a modest homestead, with decent grazing land and a respectable garden that provided fresh vegetables through most seasons. Now it was nothing but dust and disappointment, much like Zeke himself. His nearest neighbors lived 5 miles down the road, the Thornton family with their 3 boisterous sons. Other than occasional supply runs to the growing settlement of Copper Creek, Zeke kept to himself. Townsfolk had taken to calling him Stoneface Everton, a name he neither confirmed nor denied. It suited him just fine if people left him alone. The wooden fence around what had once been his prized vegetable garden was starting to splinter and fall apart, much like his hope. Zeke had stopped tending it months ago when the last of his crops withered despite his best efforts. What was the point? The earth had turned against him, hard as his own heart. He trudged back toward his modest cabin, passing the barn where his 2 horses, Renegade and Willow, whinnied softly. At least the well hadn't dried up completely yet, providing just enough water to keep his livestock alive and meet his basic needs. But if the drought continued much longer, even that small mercy would vanish. Inside the cabin, Zeke removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door. The interior was sparse but clean. A wooden table with 4 chairs dominated the main room, though no one but him had sat in those extra seats for years. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, a bookshelf with a handful of worn volumes in another. His parents' old rocking chair remained by the window, untouched since his mother passed 6 years ago. Zeke poured himself a carefully measured cup of water and drank it slowly. Conservation had become second nature. As evening approached, he prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, eating mechanically while watching the sun set through his dusty window. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it always did. Dreams of greener days haunted him, memories of his mother's garden flourishing, his father's proud smile, laughter around the dinner table. Zeke woke before dawn, his pillow damp with what he would never admit were tears. The following morning brought no relief from the heat, but it did bring something unexpected. Zeke was chopping wood, a task he performed in the early morning hours before the sun reached its peak, when he heard the distant sound of wagon wheels. Visitors were rare enough to put him on alert. He set down his axe and reached for the rifle he kept nearby, not raising it but keeping it at hand. The approaching wagon came into view, an unfamiliar sight with its faded blue canvas cover. The driver was equally unfamiliar, a woman, sitting alone on the bench seat. As the wagon drew closer, Zeke could make out more details. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with chestnut hair peeking out from beneath a practical bonnet. Her dress was simple, but clean, a faded blue that matched her wagon cover. She handled the reins with confidence, guiding the 2 mules pulling her wagon with gentle firmness. She brought the wagon to a halt about 20 paces from where Zeke stood. "Good morning," she called, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "I'm looking for the Thornton place. Am I headed in the right direction?" Zeke nodded stiffly. "5 miles further down this road. You can't miss it." He expected her to thank him and continue on her way. But instead, she climbed down from the wagon. She moved with a grace that seemed out of place in this harsh landscape. "I'm Willa Rhodes," she said, approaching him with an extended hand. "I've come from Missouri to stay with my cousin Martha Thornton. She married Jack Thornton about 5 years back." Zeke reluctantly took her hand for the briefest of moments. Her skin was softer than he expected, though he noted calluses that spoke of hard work. Zeke Everton, he replied curtly. Willa smiled, apparently untroubled by his brusque manner. Her eyes, a warm amber color, surveyed the property with interest. You have a lovely place here, Mr. Everton. Or at least, it could be. Her gaze settled on the dilapidated garden enclosure. That garden plot has good positioning. Southern exposure, some shade from the oak in late afternoon. I'd wager. Zeke bristled at what felt like criticism. It's been a drought. Nothing grows. Willa nodded thoughtfully. Drought makes things difficult, certainly, but there are ways. She looked back at her wagon. I should continue on. Thank you for the directions. You shouldn't travel alone, Zeke said, the words coming out before he could stop them. These roads can be dangerous. I've come all the way from Missouri on my own, Willa replied with a hint of pride. I suspect I can manage 5 more miles. She turned to go, then paused. I wonder, might I trouble you for a dipper of water? For myself and the mules? It's been a long morning already. Something about her straightforward request made it impossible to refuse. Zeke nodded toward the well. Help yourself. Bucket and dipper are there. Thank you kindly. As Willa watered her mules, Zeke found himself watching her movements. There was efficiency in every gesture, nothing wasted. When she finished, she returned the bucket to its place. I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Everton. Perhaps we'll cross paths again. Perhaps, Zeke replied, though he doubted it. People like her, people with light in their eyes and warmth in their smile, didn't often return to places like his. He watched her wagon until it disappeared from sight, then returned to his wood chopping with renewed vigor, as if trying to drive away the memory of amber eyes and a kind smile. 3 days passed in Zeke's usual routine of chores and solitude before he saw Willa Rhodes again. He was mending a fence when the now familiar wagon appeared on the horizon. This time, it was approaching from the direction of the Thornton place. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow as the wagon drew nearer. Willa was at the reins again, but this time her wagon bed appeared to be filled with supplies. Good afternoon, Mr. Everton, she called as she brought the mules to a halt. I hope I'm not disturbing your work. Zeke nodded stiffly. Miss Rhodes, settling in at the Thorntons? As much as one can in 3 days, she replied with a smile. Martha has been wonderful, though the house is quite full with the boys. They're good lads, but lively. An awkward silence fell between them, and Zeke wondered why she had stopped. He didn't have to wonder long. I've brought something for you, Willa said, climbing down from the wagon. She reached into the back and retrieved a burlap sack. Seedlings. Martha had extras from her greenhouse. Zeke stared at the sack she held out to him. I told you, nothing grows here. With respect, Mr. Everton, you haven't tried everything. Her voice was firm but not unkind. These are drought-resistant varieties. They won't thrive without care, but they don't need as much water as most. I don't have time for gardening, he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Time was one thing he had in abundance. Willa didn't argue. She simply placed the sack on the ground near his feet. Well, they're yours if you want them. Consider it repayment for the water you provided. She turned to go, then added, Oh, and Martha sent along some fresh bread. She baked yesterday. She retrieved a cloth-wrapped bundle from the wagon seat and placed it beside the seedlings. Before Zeke could formulate a response, she was back on her wagon, flicking the reins gently. Good day, Mr. Everton. He watched her leave, the bundle of bread and sack of seedlings at his feet like unwelcome reminders of a world he'd shut out. Eventually, he picked them up and carried them to his cabin, telling himself he was simply being practical. No sense wasting good bread. That night, as he savored the first home-baked bread he'd tasted in years, Zeke found himself staring at the sack of seedlings on his table. Something stirred within him, a feeling he couldn't quite name or didn't want to acknowledge. The next morning, he found himself at the old garden plot, clearing away dead vegetation and breaking up the hard soil with a hoe. It was foolish, he knew. These seedlings would die like everything else. But his hands seemed to have a mind of their own. By midday, he had prepared a small section of soil. He carefully planted the seedlings tomatoes, peppers, and some herbs he didn't recognize, and watered them sparingly from his precious well supply. When he finished, he stood back and looked at his work. The tiny green plants looked pathetically vulnerable against the harsh landscape. "Waste of good water," he muttered, yet he found himself checking on them the next morning. A week passed. To Zeke's surprise, the seedlings hadn't died. They hadn't exactly flourished, but they were holding their own against the unforgiving Texas sun. He found himself developing a new routine, checking the plants first thing in the morning and again in the evening, giving them just enough water to keep them alive. He was tending to them one evening, carefully loosening the soil around their bases, when he heard the now familiar sound of Willa's wagon. He straightened up, suddenly aware of how he must look on his knees in the dirt, caring for plants he'd claimed would never grow. Willa brought her wagon to a halt and waved. This time, she had a large barrel in the back of her wagon alongside other supplies. "I see you've put those seedlings to good use," she called as she approached. There was no hint of smugness in her voice, only genuine pleasure. Zeke stood and dusted off his hands. "They're still alive. For now." "They're doing better than alive, Mr. Everton. They're beginning to thrive." She bent down to examine one of the tomato plants. "See how the stems are thickening? That's a good sign." Her knowledge surprised him. "You know about gardening?" Willa nodded. "My father was a farmer in Missouri. He taught me everything he knew before he passed. It's how I helped support my mother and younger siblings growing food we could eat and sell." The mention of her family piqued Zeke's curiosity despite himself. "Are they still in Missouri?" A shadow crossed Willa's face. "My mother passed last winter. My brother John took over the farm, and he and his wife are raising our youngest sister, Abigail. My other sister, Mary, married a shopkeeper in St. Louis." She managed a small smile. "I was the one without ties, so when Martha wrote about the opportunities out west, I decided to make the journey." Zeke nodded, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. "What brings you by today?" "Oh." Willa seemed to remember her purpose. "I've brought you something. For your garden." She gestured to the barrel in her wagon. "It's a water collection system. Jack helped me put it together. It catches rainwater from your roof and stores it for gardening use." Zeke frowned. "There hasn't been rain in months." "There will be," Willa said, with a certainty that both irritated and intrigued him. "And when it comes, you'll be ready to capture every drop." Without waiting for his permission, she began unloading the barrel from her wagon. It was clearly heavy, and Zeke found himself moving forward to help her despite his reservations. "Where should we put it?" she asked. "We?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Unless you'd rather I leave it here and let you struggle with it alone?" There was a challenge in her amber eyes. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Zeke felt the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "The corner of the cabin would be best. That's where the water runs off heaviest when it rains." Together, they positioned the barrel at the corner of his cabin. Willa explained how the system worked, how to direct water from the roof into the barrel, how to access it for the garden, how to keep it from becoming stagnant. "Why are you doing this?" Zeke finally asked as they stood back to admire their work. Willa looked at him with those keen amber eyes. "Because gardens need tending, Mr. Everton, and so do people." Before he could respond to that perplexing statement, she added, "Would you like to join the Thorntons for Sunday dinner tomorrow? Martha asked me to extend the invitation. The thought of social interaction made Zeke's stomach knot. I have chores. The chores will wait, Willa replied. Even the Lord rested on Sunday. I'm not much for church either, Zeke admitted. The invitation is for dinner, not church. Her voice softened. But if you prefer your own company, I understand. I'll let Martha know. As she turned to go, Zeke found himself saying, What time? Willa's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. 2 o'clock. And bring an appetite, Martha cooks enough for an army. That night, Zeke lay awake longer than usual, his mind filled with thoughts of amber eyes and a water barrel and seedlings that refused to die in barren soil. Sunday dawned clear and hot, like every day before it. Zeke rose early and completed his essential chores, then to his own surprise found himself cleaning up for the dinner at the Thorntons. He shaved carefully, nicking himself only once. He put on his one good shirt, faded blue but clean and pressed, and his least worn pair of trousers. He even polished his boots, something he hadn't bothered with in years. As he hitched Renegade to his small buggy, Zeke told himself he was only going to be neighborly. The Thorntons had been good neighbors, keeping their distance but offering help when truly needed. It was only right to accept their invitation occasionally. The 5-mile journey passed quickly. The Thornton homestead came into view, a larger, more prosperous operation than Zeke's modest ranch. Their 2-story farmhouse was well maintained, with a wide porch and curtains in the windows. Several outbuildings stood nearby, including a barn larger than Zeke's and what appeared to be a small greenhouse. As he approached, Zeke saw activity in the yard. Jack Thornton was showing his oldest son how to repair a wagon wheel, while the 2 younger boys were chasing each other around a large oak tree. Martha Thornton was hanging laundry on a line, and beside her, helping to pin sheets, was Willa. Zeke pulled his buggy to a halt near the house. Jack looked up and raised a hand in greeting. Everton, good to see you, neighbor. Been too long. Zeke nodded, suddenly uncertain of himself. It had been over a year since he'd visited the Thornton place. Martha approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Zeke Everton, as I live and breathe. You're a sight for sore eyes. Mrs. Thornton, Zeke said, removing his hat. Thank you for the invitation. It was Willa's idea, Martha said with a smile. Said you might be in need of some company. Zeke glanced at Willa, who was now approaching with a basket of clothespins. She wore a simple dress of soft yellow, her hair partially pinned up, but with tendrils escaping to frame her face. She looked, Zeke thought, like a ray of sunlight in human form. Mr. Everton, she said, and he could have sworn there was pleasure in her voice. I'm glad you decided to come. The afternoon passed in a blur for Zeke. The Thorntons were welcoming without being overbearing. Jack talked about his cattle operation and the latest news from town. Martha served a feast of roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and green beans from their garden. The 3 Thornton boys, ages 12, 9, and 7, were well behaved for the most part, though the youngest couldn't resist asking Zeke why he lived alone, like a bear in a cave, earning himself a stern look from his mother. Throughout the meal, Zeke found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Willa. She fit seamlessly into the Thornton family, teasing the boys gently, helping Martha serve, contributing to the conversation with stories from Missouri. Yet she seemed to sense when Zeke was feeling overwhelmed by the social interaction, deftly steering the conversation away from him when needed. After the meal, Jack suggested the men sit on the porch, while Martha and Willa cleaned up. Zeke offered to help with the dishes, something his mother had taught him to do, but Martha shooed him out with Jack. On the porch, Jack offered Zeke a cigar, which he accepted. The 2 men smoked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Jack spoke. She's something, isn't she? Willa, I mean. Zeke grunted non-committally. Jack chuckled. Martha's beside herself with joy having her cousin here. Says the house finally has enough female energy to balance all us menfolk. She seems capable, Zeke offered. More than capable. She's been a godsend. Fixed up Martha's greenhouse, started a new herb garden, and she's teaching the boys their letters better than I ever could. Jack puffed on his cigar. She's got no intention of staying with us forever, though. Wants her own place eventually. Zeke didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. They smoked in silence until Martha and Willa joined them on the porch, bringing coffee. The boys ran off to play, their shouts echoing across the yard. As the afternoon waned, Zeke knew he should head back to his ranch. The thought filled him with an unfamiliar reluctance. I should get going, he finally said, standing up. Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Thornton. It was nice. Martha beamed at him. You're welcome any time, Zeke. Don't be a stranger. Jack shook his hand firmly. Good to have you, neighbor. Willa walked with Zeke to his buggy. I'm glad you came, she said softly. The food was good, Zeke replied, unsure what else to say. Willa smiled. I'll be by to check on those seedlings in a few days if that's all right. Zeke nodded, surprised by how much he wanted her to visit. The plants seem to be doing well. It's not just the plants I'm interested in checking on, Mr. Everton. Before Zeke could process that statement, Willa had turned and was walking back to the house, her yellow dress swaying gently with each step. The drive home seemed longer than the journey to the Thorntons. Zeke's mind was filled with the events of the day, the warm welcome, the delicious food, the easy conversation, and Willa. Always Willa, with her amber eyes and gentle smile and hands that brought life to dying things. When he reached his ranch, the contrast between his solitary existence and the vibrant family life he'd just experienced hit him like a physical blow. His cabin looked smaller, emptier. The silence, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. Zeke tended to his horses and checked his garden before retiring for the night. To his surprise, the plants seemed to have grown even in his brief absence. One of the tomato plants had the tiniest hint of a yellow flower forming. That night, Zeke dreamed of rain and growing things, and a woman in a yellow dress walking through his garden. The next few days passed with Zeke paying more attention to his garden than he had to anything in years. He constructed a simple shade structure to protect the most delicate seedlings during the hottest part of the day. He carefully measured out water, giving the plants just enough to survive without depleting his well. On the fourth day after the Sunday dinner, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Zeke watched them warily. False promises of rain had come and gone many times during the drought. Still, he found himself checking the water barrel Willa had brought, making sure it was properly positioned to catch any rainfall. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened considerably. A cool breeze stirred the dust, and Zeke could smell the distinctive scent of rain in the air. He secured his livestock in the barn and waited on his porch, hardly daring to hope. The first drops fell tentatively, as if testing the parched earth. Then, as if the sky had finally broken open, the rain came down in earnest, heavy, soaking rain that pounded on Zeke's roof and stirred up the dust before turning it to mud. Zeke stood at the edge of his porch, letting the cool spray hit his face. He couldn't remember the last time rain had fallen like this. The sound of it drumming on his roof was like music. He suddenly remembered the water barrel and dashed through the rain to check it. Water was already flowing from the crude gutter he'd installed, filling the barrel. Zeke laughed out loud, a rusty, unused sound, as he watched the water level rise. The rain continued through the evening and into the night. Zeke sat on his porch long after darkness fell, listening to the steady drumming on his roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The air smelled clean and new, washed of dust for the first time in months. When he finally went to bed, it was with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, he would see what the rain had done for his garden. And perhaps, if the roads weren't too muddy, Willa would come to check on her seedlings. The dawn broke clear and fresh, the world transformed by the night's rain. Puddles dotted Zeke's property, reflecting the blue sky above. The air felt different, cleaner, more alive. Zeke headed straight for his garden after feeding his livestock. The transformation was remarkable. The plants seemed to have doubled in size overnight, their leaves a more vibrant green. The tomato plant that had been forming a flower now sported 3 distinct yellow blossoms. He was examining them, amazed at the difference a single rainfall had made, when he heard approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, he saw Willa riding a chestnut mare, picking her way carefully through the muddy road. She was wearing trousers practical for riding, though uncommon for women, and her hair was braided back from her face. She looked, Zeke thought, like freedom personified. "Good morning, Mr. Everton," she called as she approached. "I came to see if your water barrel caught the rainfall." "It's full to the brim," Zeke replied, watching as she dismounted gracefully. "The garden seems to have appreciated the rain as well." Willa tied her horse to a post and joined him by the garden plot. Her eyes widened as she took in the transformed plants. "Oh, they're thriving!" she exclaimed, kneeling down to examine them more closely. "Look at these tomato blossoms. You'll have fruit in no time." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Zeke found himself kneeling beside her, pointing out the changes he'd noticed in each plant. Their hands occasionally brushed as they examined the garden together, sending an unexpected warmth through Zeke's body. "You've done well by them," Willa said, glancing at him with those amber eyes. "They've responded to your care." "They responded to the rain," Zeke corrected. "Plants need more than water, Mr. Everton. They need attention. Commitment." She looked directly at him. "Things don't grow with neglect, be they plants or relationships." Her words stirred something in Zeke, a recognition of how he'd been living these past years, neglecting not just his garden, but his connections to others, to the world around him. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked abruptly, surprising himself as much as her. Willa smiled. "I would like that very much." Inside his cabin, Zeke was suddenly conscious of the sparseness of his living conditions. He'd never been one for decorative touches, and after his mother died, he'd put away most of the items that had made the cabin feel like a home. If Willa noticed the austerity, she didn't comment. She did, however, notice the bookshelf. "You're a reader," she said, moving to examine his small collection. "My mother was," Zeke replied, busy with the coffee pot. "I keep them for her sake." Willa ran her fingers along the spines. "Thoreau, Emerson, Shakespeare, Austen. Your mother had excellent taste." She pulled out a volume. "May I?" Zeke nodded, watching as she carefully opened the book, a collection of poetry. She handled it with a reverence that told him she understood the value of books. "My father loved poetry," she said softly. "He could recite Wordsworth from memory, even while plowing a field." Zeke brought 2 cups of coffee to the table. "My mother read to us every evening. My father pretended it was just for me and my sister, but he listened just as intently." Willa sat across from him, cradling the coffee cup in her hands. "Tell me about them, your parents." No one had asked Zeke about his family in years. The words came haltingly at first, then with increasing ease as he told her about his father, a hard-working rancher, with a surprisingly gentle touch when it came to injured animals, and his mother, who had brought books and music and a garden full of flowers to their remote homestead. "My sister Sarah married a lawyer from Austin. She has 3 children now. I haven't seen them in years." Zeke stared into his coffee. "After my mother died and my father followed a year later, I just withdrew." "Grief can do that," Willa said gently. "It can make the world seem too bright, too loud. Sometimes hiding away feels like the only option." The understanding in her voice made Zeke look up. "You've lost people too." Willa nodded. My father when I was 16, my mother just last year. There were times I wanted to disappear into myself. But I had siblings who needed me. You're strong, Zeke observed. Not always. But I try to keep growing, like those plants in your garden. She smiled. Speaking of which, I brought something else for you. She reached into a small satchel she'd brought with her and pulled out a packet of seeds. Zinnias. They're tough flowers. Colorful. They'll brighten up the place. Zeke accepted the packet, turning it over in his hands. I haven't planted flowers since my mother died. Maybe it's time to start again. They finished their coffee and Zeke walked Willa back to her horse. The morning had warmed considerably, drying some of the mud from the previous night's rain. Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Everton, Willa said as she prepared to mount her horse. Zeke, he said suddenly. My name is Zeke. Her smile was worth the momentary discomfort of offering this small intimacy. Thank you for the coffee, Zeke, and thank you for sharing your family with me. Will you? Zeke hesitated, then forged ahead. Will you come again? To check on the garden? I'd like that, Willa replied. Perhaps the day after tomorrow? I promised to help Martha with preserving some early berries tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, Zeke confirmed, and was rewarded with another smile before she mounted her horse and rode away. That afternoon, Zeke expanded his garden plot and planted Willa's zinnia seeds along the border. The work was satisfying in a way he'd forgotten physical labor could be. He found himself whistling as he worked another thing he hadn't done in years. The following day, Zeke rode into Copper Creek for supplies. It had been several weeks since his last visit, and he found the town had grown even in that short time. New buildings were going up along Main Street, and the general store had expanded its inventory. As he loaded his purchases into his wagon, Zeke overheard two men talking nearby. Drought's finally breaking, one said. Had a good rain out my way 2 nights ago. Same at my place, the other replied. If it keeps up, we might have a decent harvest after all. Just in time, too. My eldest is getting married this fall. Need a good crop to pay for the wedding. The casual conversation about future plans struck Zeke. How long had it been since he'd thought about the future as anything but an extension of his solitary present? On the ride back to his ranch, Zeke found himself thinking about what his land could become if the rains continued. He could expand his cattle herd, perhaps plant a larger garden next season. Maybe even replace some of the more worn-down fences. And for the first time in years, these thoughts included another person. He imagined showing Willa a thriving garden, perhaps building a proper greenhouse like the one at the Thornton place. The realization that he was including Willa in his future visions both startled and warmed him. He hardly knew the woman, yet she had already changed the way he saw his land, his life. The next day dawned clear and promising. Zeke found himself paying more attention to his appearance than usual, selecting his newest shirt and taking extra time with his shaving. He told himself it was simply because he would have company, not because of who that company would be. Willa arrived mid-morning, this time in her wagon. She waved cheerfully as she approached, and Zeke found himself waving back. I've brought something, she called as she drew nearer. For the garden. When she climbed down, Zeke saw she had a burlap sack in one hand and a covered basket in the other. More seedlings? He asked. Better, Willa replied with a smile. Compost, rich soil from Martha's pile. It will help your plants grow stronger. Together they worked in the garden, carefully adding the nutrient-rich soil around the base of each plant. Willa showed Zeke how to mix it properly with the existing soil, explaining the benefits of each component. The earthworms are particularly important, she said, gently holding one up for him to see. They aerate the soil, allowing the roots to breathe. Zeke watched her hands as she worked capable, gentle hands that seemed to bring life to everything they touched. When their fingers occasionally brushed, He no longer felt the urge to pull away. After they finished with the garden, Willa opened her basket. "I thought we might have a picnic, if you're amenable. It's such a beautiful day." The basket contained a veritable feast: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and early strawberries from the Thornton greenhouse. Willa spread a blanket under the shade of an oak tree, and they sat together, the garden visible from their spot. "Have you always worked the land?" Willa asked as they ate. Zeke nodded. "Born to it. Never wanted anything else. Though I did consider joining the cavalry when I was younger." "What stopped you?" "My father needed help here. And then, after the war." Zeke shrugged. "Seemed like enough fighting had been done." Willa's expression was thoughtful. "My father fought. Came back changed, though he tried to hide it. I think that's why he loved poetry so much. It helped him remember beauty existed." "Is that why you garden? To find beauty?" "Partly," Willa admitted. "But also because it gives me a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic. I can't make it rain or stop the frost, but I can prepare the soil and tend the plants. Do my part and trust in nature to do the rest." Her words resonated with Zeke in a way he hadn't expected. Wasn't that what he'd stopped doing? Trusting? After loss and drought and disappointment, he'd stopped doing his part, expecting only failure. They talked through the afternoon, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, their hopes. Zeke found himself telling Willa things he hadn't spoken of in years: his father's quiet wisdom, his mother's love of music, his sister's determination to get an education despite their remote location. In return, Willa told him about growing up in Missouri, about helping her father in the fields and her mother with the younger children, about her dream of having her own farm someday, where she could grow both food and flowers. "Martha and Jack have been wonderful," she said, "but I don't want to be a permanent guest. I want something that's mine." "Land is scarce around here," Zeke said, "but there's a parcel about 2 miles south that might be available. Old man Jenkins passed last year, and his son has no interest in ranching." "Really?" Willa's eyes lit up. "How many acres?" "About 40, I believe. Good water source. The cabin's small, but solid." Would you show it to me sometime?" Willa asked hesitantly. "Of course," Zeke replied, surprised by his eagerness to do so. "Perhaps next week, if the weather holds?" As the sun began to lower in the sky, Willa reluctantly began packing up her basket. "I should get back to the Thorntons before dark." Zeke helped her gather the picnic supplies and fold the blanket. As they walked back to her wagon, he found himself walking closer to her than necessary, drawn to her warmth. "Thank you for the picnic," he said as they reached the wagon, "and for the compost." Willa smiled up at him. "Thank you for sharing your afternoon with me, and your stories." There was a moment, brief but electric, when Zeke thought about leaning down to kiss her. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. But the moment passed, and Willa climbed onto her wagon. "When should I come to see the Jenkins place?" she asked. "Tuesday? I can meet you there around noon." Willa nodded. "Tuesday at noon. I'll look forward to it." As she drove away, Zeke realized he would be looking forward to it too, more than he'd looked forward to anything in years. The following days passed in a blur of activity for Zeke. He tended his garden with renewed vigor, pleased to see the plants responding to the improved soil and regular watering. The zinnia seeds had sprouted, tiny green shoots promising future blooms. He also found himself cleaning his cabin more thoroughly than he had in years, washing windows that had been clouded with dust, sweeping corners long neglected. He even pulled his mother's old quilt from the cedar chest where it had been stored since her death, airing it in the sun before placing it carefully on the back of the rocking chair. On Monday, Zeke rode to Copper Creek again, this time with a specific purpose. He visited the general store where he purchased supplies he hadn't bothered with in ages: coffee of a better quality than his usual, sugar, and even a small jar of honey. He also stopped at the land office to inquire about the Jenkins property. "It's available, all right," the land agent, Mr. Patterson, told him. 42 acres, good water rights. The son is asking a fair price, considering the cabin and barn are still in decent condition. "I might know someone interested," Zeke said. "Could you prepare the details? I'll bring them by to speak with you if they want to proceed." Mr. Patterson raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about who Zeke might be bringing, but he simply nodded and promised to have the paperwork ready. Tuesday morning found Zeke more nervous than he could remember being in years. He bathed carefully, shaved with extra attention, and put on his best clothes. He told himself it was simply because he was acting as a sort of land agent, but he knew the truth was simpler and more complicated. He wanted to impress Willa. He arrived at the Jenkins property half an hour early to check the condition of things. The small ranch had been vacant for months, but Jenkins's son had paid someone to keep an eye on it, so there was no major damage. The cabin was indeed small but solidly built, with 2 rooms and a covered porch. The barn needed some repairs but was structurally sound. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, providing a reliable water source. Zeke was examining the garden plot overgrown, but with good soil when he heard the approach of Willa's wagon. She waved as she came into view, her face alight with anticipation. Zeke found himself waving back, a warmth spreading through his chest at the sight of her. "Is this it?" Willa called as she brought the wagon to a halt. "It looks charming already." Zeke helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on her waist. "It's solid," he said. "Needs work, but the bones are good." Willa's eyes sparkled with excitement as they toured the property. She asked intelligent questions about the water rights, the soil quality, the condition of the roof. She examined the creek, tested the pump at the well, and spent considerable time in the overgrown garden area. "The soil here is excellent," she said, crumbling some between her fingers. Someone knew what they were doing. "Mrs. Jenkins was known for her garden," Zeke replied. "People came from miles around for her tomatoes." Willa walked the perimeter of what had once been a thriving garden, her expression thoughtful. "I could expand it here," she said, pointing to a sunny patch. "Maybe plant berry bushes along that fence line. And there's room for a small greenhouse over there." Watching her plan and dream, Zeke felt something within him shifting, a wall crumbling, a door opening. This vibrant woman with soil on her hands and dreams in her eyes was awakening parts of himself he'd thought long dead. "Do you think I could afford it?" Willa asked as they sat on the porch steps, looking out over the property. "I have some savings from selling my portion of the Missouri farm to my brother, but I don't know if it's enough." "I spoke with the land agent yesterday," Zeke admitted. "The price is fair, and if you're short, there's the bank in town. Or—" he hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Or I could lend you what you need." Willa looked at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You would do that? For me?" Zeke nodded, unable to articulate the depth of what he was beginning to feel for her. "I think you'd make this place thrive again, like you did with my garden." "Your garden thrived because you cared for it," Willa said softly. "I just gave you a starting point." Their eyes met, and Zeke felt that same electric moment from days before. This time, he didn't let it pass. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, brief, but full of promise. When they separated, Willa's cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were steady on his. "I've wanted to do that since I saw you kneeling in your garden," she admitted. "I've wanted to do that since you brought me seedlings," Zeke replied with a small smile. Willa laughed, the sound like music in the quiet afternoon. "We've wasted time then." "I'm good at that," Zeke said ruefully. "Wasting time." "No," Willa said, taking his hand in hers. not wasting, waiting. Sometimes the soil needs time to rest before it can nurture new growth. They sat together on the porch steps, hands entwined, looking out over the land that might soon be Willa's. Plans and possibilities seemed to hang in the air around them, a garden expanding, a house filled with books and music, perhaps even children playing under the oak trees. "Would you like to go into town tomorrow?" Zeke asked, "to speak with the land agent and the bank?" Willa nodded, her expression both excited and nervous. "It's a big step." "The first of many, I hope," Zeke said, surprising himself with his boldness. Willa's smile was all the answer he needed. The following day, they rode into Copper Creek together. Willa wore a dress of deep blue that brought out the amber in her eyes, and Zeke found himself stealing glances at her throughout the journey. The land agent was openly surprised to see Zeke Everton with a woman, but he quickly recovered and treated Willa with respect as they discussed the Jenkins property. The price was indeed within Willa's means, especially with the favorable terms the bank was willing to offer a relative of the respected Thornton family. By the end of the day, preliminary paperwork had been signed, and Willa was the prospective owner of 42 acres of Texas land. The final transfer would take place in 2 weeks, once the current owner Jenkins's son in Dallas could sign the necessary documents. As they rode back toward their respective homes, Willa's excitement was palpable. "I can hardly believe it," she said. "My own land, my own home." "It suits you," Zeke replied. "The independence." Willa looked at him thoughtfully. "Independence doesn't have to mean solitude, Zeke. I've learned that from my cousins. Building a life can be even more satisfying when it's shared." The implication of her words hung between them, full of possibility. At the crossroads where their paths would separate Willa to the Thorntons, Zeke to his ranch, they paused. "Will you come tomorrow?" Zeke asked. "To see the garden? I think the first tomato is nearly ripe." "I wouldn't miss it," Willa replied. Then, with a boldness that matched his own from the day before, she leaned across from her wagon seat and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "Until tomorrow, Zeke Everton." Zeke watched her wagon until it disappeared from sight, his cheek warm where her lips had touched it. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Zeke and Willa spent nearly every day together, alternating between his ranch and her soon-to-be property. At his place, they tended the flourishing garden, harvesting the first ripe tomatoes and peppers, watching the zinnias begin to form colorful buds. At the Jenkins place, they made plans for improvements, repairing the barn roof, clearing the garden area, patching the cabin's porch. Their kisses became more frequent, more comfortable, though always respectful. Zeke found himself opening up to Willa in ways he hadn't with anyone in years, sharing not just stories from his past but hopes for his future, hopes that increasingly included her. The day before the final land transfer was to take place, they worked together at Zeke's ranch, harvesting vegetables for a special dinner he had planned. The garden that had once been barren dirt was now a riot of growth. Tomato plants heavy with fruit, pepper plants standing tall, herbs sending their fragrance into the air, and zinnias beginning to bloom in shades of red, orange, and pink. As they worked side by side, Zeke found himself overcome with gratitude and another emotion he was only now letting himself acknowledge: love. "You've changed everything," he said suddenly, straightening up from picking a particularly fine tomato. Willa looked at him, her hands full of peppers. "What do you mean?" "This garden, my home, me." Zeke gestured around them. "Before you came, everything was dry, dead. I was just existing, not living." "Zeke, please, let me say this." He took a deep breath. "You watered my garden without asking. You brought life back to this place, to me, when I'd convinced myself nothing would ever grow here again." Willa set down her basket and moved closer to him. "I saw a possibility where you saw barrenness, but you did the work, Zeke. You tended the plants, you built the shade structure, You made the garden thrive. Because you showed me it was possible. Because you made me want to try again. They stood close now, the garden surrounding them with evidence of renewal. Willa Rhodes, Zeke said, taking her hands in his. I love you. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a short time. But I love you. And I don't want to waste any more years being alone when I could be building something with you. Tears shone in Willa's amber eyes. I love you too, Zeke. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing up for your land, stubborn as the Texas dirt, unwilling to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Zeke pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion he'd been holding back. She responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Zeke rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said softly. Not right away if you don't want to. Take all the time you need. But say you'll be my wife someday. Willa's smile was radiant. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you, Zeke Everton. And I don't need much time. I know what I want. And it's you. It's us. Building something together. That evening, they shared the news with the Thorntons over a celebratory dinner at Zeke's ranch. Martha cried happy tears. Jack shook Zeke's hand so vigorously it nearly hurt, and the Thornton boys asked if this meant they could visit the garden whenever they wanted. As the summer progressed into fall, Zeke and Willa divided their time between his established ranch and her new property. They decided that after their wedding, they would make Zeke's place their primary home, as it was larger and more established, but keep Willa's land for expansion, particularly for the extensive gardens and greenhouse she planned to create. They were married on a perfect October day, with the Thorntons hosting the celebration. Zeke's sister Sarah came from Austin with her family, tearfully embracing the brother she hadn't seen in years and welcoming the woman who had brought him back to life. Willa's siblings traveled from Missouri, bringing with them stories and mementos of their parents that made Willa both cry and laugh. As Zeke watched his bride dance with her young nephew, her face alight with joy. He marveled at how completely his life had transformed in just a few months, from isolation and bitterness to connection and hope, from barren earth to a garden overflowing with life. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home together, Zeke pulled Willa into his arms. Do you remember the first day you came here? He asked, nuzzling her neck. Of course, Willa replied, leaning into his embrace. You were so gruff, so determined to be left alone. And you were so determined not to leave me alone, he said with a chuckle, bringing me seedlings, watering my garden without asking. The best gardens need tending, Willa said, turning to face him. And so do the best hearts. Under a sky filled with stars, Zeke kissed his wife, grateful beyond words for the woman who had seen possibility where he had seen only desolation, who had watered his garden and his soul back to life. 5 years later, the Everton Ranch was transformed. The once small garden had expanded to cover nearly an acre, with vegetables, herbs, and flowers growing in careful rotation. A greenhouse stood nearby, where Willa started seedlings to sell in town and cultivated delicate plants that couldn't survive the Texas heat unprotected. The cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing family 3-year-old twins, Sarah and John, named for their grandmothers and grandfathers, and baby Elizabeth, just 6 months old. Willa's property had become a productive orchard, with apple and peach trees beginning to bear fruit. They'd built a small cabin there as well, where they sometimes stayed during the harvest season or when they simply wanted a change of scenery. On this particular evening, Zeke sat on the porch, watching Willa show the twins how to water the zinnias that bordered the garden. The flowers bloomed in a riot of color, their faces turned toward the setting sun. Gentle now, John, Willa instructed as their son wielded a small watering can with more enthusiasm than precision. The flowers need water, but not a flood. Sarah, more cautious than her brother, carefully tipped her can over a particularly vibrant pink zinnia. Like this, Mama. Perfect, Willa replied, her smile as warm as the evening air. Baby Elizabeth gurgled from her basket beside Zeke, reaching pudgy hands toward a butterfly that fluttered past. Zeke gently caught one of those tiny hands in his, marveling at the perfection of his daughter's fingers. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Willa gathered the children and joined Zeke on the porch. She settled beside him, Elizabeth in her arms, the twins playing at their feet. Happy? Zeke asked, though he already knew the answer. Willa's smile was his response, as warm and life-giving as the first rain after a drought. Remember when you told me nothing would grow here? She teased gently. Zeke looked at his flourishing garden, his beautiful children, his beloved wife. I've never been so glad to be proven wrong. They sat together as twilight descended, surrounded by the garden that had brought them together and the family that had grown from their love, proof that even the hardest earth could bloom with the right tending and enough patient care.